All right, back to restoration ecology. Let's look first at a short definition of what that is. It's the process of repairing damage caused by humans to the diversity and dynamics of indigenous systems. Some other definitions. Restoration ecology is the discipline of scientific inquiry dealing with the restoration of ecological systems. Simplest form would be to do restoration ecology would be to remove a perturbation and allow natural recovery. So it would be the removal of any kind of um, obstacle or problem that's causing the ecosystem to degrade. Full restoration would be creating a resilient ecosystem from one that's been damaged and creating one that's resilient with the capacity to recover from stress. So that would be like the ideal, that you can put all the animals, plants, soil, hydrology, minerals, dynamics that are all there so that it has the strength of the natural system, which it usually is able to handle some level of stress. So fixing damaged ecosystems, that's what it is. Let's next talk about a little history of restoration. So it started out in this country with a man named Aldo Leopold and the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. And Aldo Leopold was one of the very first to think about the fact that the ecosystems that we saw in the United States around his time in 1935 were were important and limited. They're not going to be there forever, and more developments happening, so they're going to shrink through time, and that it was important for us to understand them and understand them to in a way that allowed us to actually restore and reconstruct them. In 1935, he bought an old farm and started restoring the tall grass prairie that used to be there. Um, and he did that. He called it the Curtis Prairie, and it was on this old worn out piece of farmland near University of Wisconsin Madison. Now that Curtis Prairie still exists. It's been maintained, um, and it's part of the university's arboretum. So a big area where there's some restored forest and wetland and tallgrass prairie. But him and his family and other workers he got helped replant the native tallgrass prairie on the farm. So he was one of the very first to do this. And if you think about it, it's like think about something today where everyone kind of just assumes there's plenty of it. Um, it's harder to imagine these days because I think we're really facing a lot of our resource limitations. But still, there's something you can think of that's just there's plenty of it that no one really thinks about or values, and no one's worried about saving it. He was, kind of considered a little bit kooky at the time when everyone's thinking, oh, there's plenty of land, plenty of farmland, plenty of prairie, plenty of forest. Why spend time trying to, you know, plant and restore some of it? So this was edgy. He could be considered, he's pretty alternative in his time to do this. But he said it's really important for us to understand the earth, to science, to look at the earth itself and ecosystems, and how do we reconstruct what we find in the wild. And so it was a novel combination of agriculture and ecology which gave rise to the science and art of ecological restoration. He understood the value of restoration science was twofold. One was basic research on understanding ecosystems. Another was knowing how a technique on how to restore and reassemble ecosystems. And then ecologically, it was a way to test ecological theories we had. If we thought, that certain species were interdependent with each other, well, we could test that by planting them. Certain wild species needed each other. We could plant them in the wild or plant them at a restoration site separately and then together and see which did better. So it was a way to test theory that we had on ecology. This is a picture of a prairie in the Midwest. It's about north central Oklahoma. And now, this prairie, if you might have remembered, prairies used to have a certain animal on them that widespread. Well, buffalo used to be throughout the prairie areas of North America. Millions and millions of buffalo roamed the area until we decided to get rid of them and they were hunted and their hides were sold. And this is a big pile of skeletons, mostly I think skulls of the buffalo. But one of the big reasons the United States people, or I don't really know exactly who did it, but it was one of our techniques to destroy the food source of native peoples in the Midwest. So the buffalo were slaughtered almost to extinction. Anyhow, besides that sad fact, the buffalo impacted the prairie quite a bit. So let me get rid of this picture for you. So what you're looking at here is a depression in the land. It's a low-lying area. You can kind of see that the plants look brighter, kind of lime green down in the middle of that grassy area. That's a depression. So it's wetter, almost like a wetland. And that was a historic buffalo wallow. So where the buffalo would congregate and root around and dig in the soil. And they were just so concentrated in the area while they were eating grasses that it created depression. And those depressions are all over the Midwest, and those are important habitats. They're like vernal pools, wetlands, and things. And without the buffalo, they wouldn't be there. But in a ecosystem like the prairie, the buffalo were an essential part of that, of structuring that prairie. So again, in this actually picture is from current day prairie restored on this preserve in Oklahoma. And if they really wanted to make it as strong of an ecosystem and as accurately restored to the original type, they would also need an animal out there to do some of the interactions like the buffalo did. So that's something important to think about. This is just a picture from Aldo Leopold's property, the Curtis Prairie, showing a Civilian Conservation Corps crewman planting tall grass prairie plants into this old farm field to restore the prairie. The CCC boys, as they were known at the time, did all kinds of um, projects. They built bridges, planted trees, lots of things, kind of like AmeriCorps does today. The AmeriCorps that we have today was modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was one of these programs that helped reduce unemployment and get us out of the Depression a long time ago. Another picture of the CCC boys, and they did not have pipes and sprinkler irrigation systems then, so these plants, prairie plants that were planted out there in these early restoration efforts were hand watered with buckets of water. So it was hard work. Here's a picture, just an overall map of the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And this is the Curtis Prairie. So the original in the kind of center, just to the left, you can see it. It's a little fuzzy. That's the Curtis Prairie where it's kind of little spotted area. But there's also forests, marsh, wetlands, etc. All of this is now, they are restored habitats of the native region as examples of restorations of native habitats for the university's research. So fire is a really important element that I mentioned before, and that's really important for prairies. It does a number of things. It stimulates the soil microbes, and it takes all that dead, dry material that was on top and all the minerals and nutrients and biomass that's in the dead grasses gets released back into the soil through fire in the form of ash. So it adds nutrients, it enriches the soil nutrients, and it also takes out any kind of shrubs or trees that are starting to encroach and invade on the prairie. So, and it also dealkalizes the soil. Excuse me, it deacidifies the soil. It's alkalizing it, meaning it's making it less acidic. And that's important. The prairie soil's acidity level is really important for the plants and the microbes, and then thus the animals. So if the fire is not, if the prairie doesn't get fire and the fire isn't set somehow or get ignited every few years, the soils get more and more acid, and that's a problem. And then the plants don't do as well, and the animals don't do as well that depend on the plants, etc. So the fire has another function of deacidifying. Another restoration site early on in the 50s. This guy or gal is running. Ah, here comes the fire. So that's just a little bit about the prairies and the restoration history there. Um, One other thing I wanted to mention um, was a restoration effort that's being done around Chicago, another Midwestern example, but it did start in the Midwest, so it's not just because I live there, but I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So one of um, the people that I met in my restoration work was a man named Stephen Packard, and he started this magazine. It's what I'm showing you the cover of. It's actually it was a an activism effort to restore some of the small inner city empty lots around Chicago, the greater Chicago area. And he it kind of you could if you ever heard of Sierra Club, you can kind of think of that as something that's similar, but a group of these outdoorsy hiker type of people that wanted to clear out some of these empty lots that were around the city areas, some of the suburbs, and even more in real urban areas, that these empty lots that were overgrown. And they started finding when they started clearing out all the the overgrown shrubs and exotic kind of weeds and stuff, they would find some of the trees that were in there, older, bigger trees. And they also started to see some of the wildflowers that were native to the prairies around Chicago and in Chicago before Chicago was even Chicago. And they'd see some of those prairie plants that had not been seen in that area for over 100 years. Some of them started to grow again. And it was simply because all the brush was removed, the weeds, the overgrowth of shrubs didn't allow enough light to the soil to allow these native wildflowers to sprout. So they started doing more and more and more around Chicago and seeing being able to somewhat restore these empty, overgrown kind of ghetto lots to pretty little parks and native wilderness areas. And I apologize for the fuzziness of this picture. I wasn't not able to find a better map, but in that little image there, the map of the restoration sites that are involved with Chicago wilderness is that the blue area is Lake Michigan, and then the yellow area is the urban area and surrounding urban areas of Chicago. And every red dot that you see is a Chicago wilderness restoration site. So within the city matrix, they had um, hundreds of little restorations done. It was pretty cool. By the way, another side note, Chicago is named after um, it's the word Chicago, which comes from the Miami people and similar to the one the Potawatomi and Ojibwe used for this site. And the best interpretation, well, Chicago means skunk or onion and it just means something really stinky and strong. The area right where Chicago, the downtown area, used to be a vast wetland where a lot of wild onions grew, and it was just kind of a wetland can be kind of stinky. So that's what Chicago comes from, Chicago, which means stinky onion field, or sometimes used that word is used for skunk.